everyone, and welcome to another episode of Mind, Body, and Roots. Today, I have a very esteemed guest, a good friend of mine, and his name is Shailin Patel. I met him at Penn State. He is a healthcare consultant and does a billion other things, but I will let him talk about that. So, go ahead, Shailin. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Healthcare consultant in a former life, I'll say. I work as a product manager now at a vet tech company. I work on our data integrations and our AI initiatives as well. So all exciting stuff for those of you who kind of don't know what product management really is. It's a discipline that exists inside of a lot of like engineering disciplines, I'll say, or a lot of engineering focused companies. Primarily, I work in software, so I do software product management. And really, I'm the person that's helping guide and shape some of the features or some of the products that you're interacting in a day-to-day basis. So I take feedback from customers all the time, and then we prioritize what we think is important. And we go and build from there and set our engineering teams with some direction and some clarity. So that's what I do.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, it's interesting to see how people's journeys evolve. And like you've definitely went from one thing to another thing and to another thing. And it's just
Yeah.
crazy to see your trajectory of growth as a person. But like let's start at the beginning, Shailin. Like you did start as a healthcare consultant. That's how we met at Penn State.
Yeah.
How did you shift from that to your current position as a product manager?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think so. When we were at Penn State, I was studying two things, and the first was neuroscience, and the other one was around health policy administration. And we met through an HPA class. I forget which one in particular, but obviously over the years, like the memories have built up, so you're not as cogent or as clear on some of the items in the past. But that's how we met, and really my big interest was in around how the systems of organizations and operations typically tended to work, and then I wanted to utilize that especially within the healthcare context, because even back then you could tell that it wasn't necessarily a perfect environment or a perfect place, right? You live in the United States and you hear about all of the issues with the cost of healthcare quite a bit, and then you hear in some other countries where maybe the cost isn't necessarily an issue, but access is more of an issue, right? So I was really interested in helping try to solve that problem a little bit. And then also just from neuroscience too, like I've always been interested in how people operate and how they think, and then, how they make their decisions in particular, because we, in economics, you're kind of taught that you should expect or assume a rational consumer. And I think that in the reality or the practicality of these types of things, it's not always necessarily the case, right? People make emotional buying decisions quite often, and and you can see that more so nowadays than I think you might have when that idea within economics of the rational consumer was initially brought out, right? And so that kind of led me to this path of trying to figure out well, what is it that I would kind of want to do or would like to do in that sense. And we were in a class one day, and somebody from Nemours and then from Johns Hopkins, we had two people come in, and then they presented what they do, and one of them just so happened to be the COO, but he never let us led that on in the beginning, because I'm sure more than just myself would have walked up to him after class to talk to them or anything like that. And that kind of led me to this a shadowing / internship that was there at Nemours. It was really cool to see that an actual children's hospital, go through, its day to day and some of the challenges and things like that they faced. And that is kind of what, started that trajectory a little bit into healthcare consulting. And I was in it for a brief period of time, I'll say, but the real interesting part is that we get into something that we exit out of college or that we leave out of college. And it's not almost always ever going to be the case that that's the one thing that you stick with in particular, right? It's a little bit different for somebody like you, or somebody who went to medical school or law school or something like that. There, it tends to stick a little bit more because you've spent so much time behind that particular craft. But for, most people with bachelor's degrees or something like that, they might have it in something, and then where they end up, it can be a totally different thing. But I think it's all about the journey in terms of the skills that you're gaining along the way, and the knowledge that you're then gaining as well. So in 2017, my dad had asked me if I could help him with his clinic. he was purchasing one. And so my dad's a veterinarian, and this would be like the first time he's ever owned like a business. And he obviously didn't want to go through this like venture alone. And I probably owe like a lot of my own personal success to like my parents, especially because they funded like almost all of it when I was in school and things like that. And so yeah, that was where it was. And so I couldn't really like say no. And I also was intrigued by that idea and interested in it. So I wrote a letter to my guru and was like, hey, like, this is kind of like the opportunity that's come up in front of me to be able to help my parents. And I really do want to do that. But like, I don't know if it's like the right decision, especially because like, I'm like, I forget at the time. If I'm 31 now, and it's man, my math is not as good, and it's like 2017. Well, you know what? I'm about like 24, like 25-ish, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just like, it's like super early in my career.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking like, oh, what do I do? Like, this isn't like most people don't make pivots into businesses, right? Like especially like that early on. In the sense of like traditional businesses, they'll do it if they don't have anything else going for them, or if they feel like they're stuck in something dead end. But I felt like there was a significant level of growth that was out there for me, at least in the healthcare space. But my guru just went and said like, you should help your parents, right? Essentially, ideally, being a good son is about supporting them when you need them. And it may seem like a decision where in the current moment that you don't think it's right for your career, but have faith in God that like it'll lead you to where it is that you would want to go. And so I took those words, and I just went and was like, okay, let's go ahead and do that. Right. And so I dove right in and with my dad with the business. So from making like, like a full salary, as like an employee at a company with benefits, etc., like $80,000-$90,000, you go from that to like, all right, I'm going to go to this, and I'm going to make minimum wage now. So, right. Cause that's all like, like my dad could technically afford to pay me at that time. And this is also him not taking a paycheck for himself for his services. Right. So he's like, I'd rather pay you at least so you have some pocket money or something like that to spend, right? Because like, you're 25, like I expect you to get married at some point in time. You can't do that if you're completely and totally broke, right? So I was, how else are you gonna like, take a girl?
Yeah.
It's all like, I'll pay you, and then we'll go from there. So him and I, like, we went and we started. In the beginning, it was just us, like, and I never really knew why my dad ever became like a veterinarian. Especially like when I was growing up, I'm like, there's like no way, like this dude, this Indian, like, man who has traveled all the way from like, from his home in Gujarat to Canada to here, and like, poured ridiculous amounts of hours into like, having to basically relearn to become a veterinarian again, so that way he could get his license again, right? There's no way, like, like, it's like, why would you go through all that? I never knew it until like I actually like, like sat with him and like was holding a dog in front of him, like, as like the technician, right? And like, and I'm seeing him interact with the client that's there, like the pet parent that's in front of us, and then with those patients. And like, I'm just like, geez, man, that makes so much sense. Cause like it clicked in my head, because like he loved it. Like in just being able to take care of the animal, making sure that they felt like, they were heard, or like their voice was heard in a sense. And it's really difficult to do that, like as an advocate for an animal, or like, just as like any sort of like, patient, like a caregiver, even in the human healthcare space, to actually hear what it is that they want, and then like, being able to advocate for them. And so that was like one of those things where I like recognized, and I realized that I was just like, oh crap, like this is why he's done it the whole place. There's a true passion that he felt for it. And he felt like part of his purpose in life was also aligned to that as well. And so that really opened up a lot. But with every single small business comes its set of challenges, and like, there's a lot of struggle, especially for like the first like 2 years. I would say, like, I think we barely turned a profit, if anything. Like, we were break even in a sense. And there were days where, man, like, I'm telling you right now, like stuff that would take us maybe like an entire week to make, like when now the like, that happens in a day now, right? Like they're like, and this is after like, what is it, like 8 years almost, right? Like, we're coming on to the 8th year essentially, or whatever. We started in December of 2017, technically 2018, because, it was the last 2 weeks. But I digress. But yeah, and there was a lot of that. And so in that space, I found myself having to be this person who had to, like, they say you wear many hats inside of business. I think that's like a lie. You kind of do everything. Like, there is no many hats. Like, there's one hat and it's all encompassing, and it's you. You're the
And
one
it's you.
responsible. Is there an issue with, like, the Wi-Fi? Okay, great. You're also IT now. Is somebody, like, upset at some medication, like, that they're not able to give to their dog? Great. You're customer service and support. This other hospital wants, this person's records so that way they're able to, be like, they can see the specialist. Yeah, you're also the entire, like, referral department, the medical, the list goes on and on. A toilet's broken or something like that. Yep, janitorial services, here you are as well, right? The roles are never ending. So, but I don't think, like, you wear multiple hats. I think it's just one big hat and just, like, swallows you up whole. Right? But yeah, so that was what I was doing, and I think the only hat that I didn't really wear was, like, the actual clinician's hat. Like, in a sense, right? I think because, well, one, I'm not licensed to practice. Did I learn quite a bit about it? Yeah, like a ton. I think, like, being able to diagnose, like, or just be seeing and diagnosing, like, even like minor issues and stuff like that, I was able to, I'd say, get pretty good at. Not that I would, right? Because that's unethical. But but you get what I'm saying. You learn some of the tricks of the trade as you continue to view it. And one of the big problems that we were having at the time was, especially, it was around software, right? And so I'm here and I'm thinking about, like, well, what can we do to make, like, pet parents' lives easier? Like, this is like, it's a kind of like a conundrum, not only, like, for my own life, like, easier, but also for, like, the other people. So when we look at, like, the medical record system, the PIMS, right? Like, you have experience with it inside of, like, dentistry, doctors have experience with it inside of human healthcare, and vets also have it too. Almost every type of profession that's inside of healthcare has a patient information management system of some kind. And when we looked at it, like, it was cool, but, like, it wasn't necessarily the tool that we needed. Right. And ours was completely server based. So there was a computer that we had inside of our pharmacy at the time that was like, hey, this is our PIM. Like, this is where everything will run off of. So if something ever happened to the computer, goodbye data, goodbye everything, right? You're done. And that, I would say, is even more modern than some of, like, the other veterinary clinics that might be out there, who are still paper and pen and put everything into a filing cabinet. And you put that out, and that's how you write out notes. But the problem with a server-based PIM is that you're stuck to where the server is located. So my dad was always stuck to the office because, it, right? Writing records takes some time, especially if you're passionate about the craft, or if you want to write good records and make sure that you've captured all the information. So that way, in the future, should anybody need them or you need to reference them back, you have the most accurate recollection of that information. And that, like, that helps tremendously with healthcare decisions as, like, you move forward too, or patient care decisions. Sorry, it's probably better way to put it. But anyway, so that was one of the biggest problems that we had too. The other one was that I was having a really hard time getting people to just be compliant. It's hard enough for a doctor to be like, hey, let me, like, you take this medication, and if you don't do it, it'll kill you, right? Or, like, or whatever, right? So, like, if you're a doctor and you tell that to a patient, then they'll, like, take it a little bit seriously and then, like, go ahead and do it. You can't make that threat for preventative medication ever, because it's just preventative medicine. It's the same thing with flossing. And as I've told you in my recent experience of taking floss on vacation after what my dentist told me, I was just like, hey, like, like, this is a thing, right? And so you're not always going to do it. And that's just one of those types of, I'll say, bridges that need to get gapped, especially between, like, a clinician and a provider to whoever the patient is, or, the patient's caregiver. In our case, with veterinary medicine, it's almost always the pet parent that you're trying to bridge the gap to. Yeah. They were well-intentioned, for sure, but they had a really difficult time remembering, like, when to give it, right? So you have the problem of, like, okay, I know I got to give this medicine once a month, but they're not going to go in. And I think I mentioned this to you before. I was really interested in systems and processes and whatnot. And I knew that if that's just me personally, but most people aren't into any of that type of stuff. But if you're not into it and you're not going to set anything for yourself in terms of, like, a system or a habit or whatever, you're most likely not going to follow it, especially when it comes to things like medication schedules or whatever, when they're so sparsed apart, like once a month or once every 3 month schedules, but for like pets and things like that. And so that was another problem that we were facing. Like, how do I bridge that with, like, everybody had an iPhone or an Android in their pocket, but I couldn't, like, go through do any of that. And amongst that, there were like a slew of other things that were just like, nitpicks or whatever. And that was kind of where I looked into like, well, I know technology can solve a lot of this type of stuff. And the first problem I didn't really know. I was like, it was more like I cannot build a cloud-based PIMS myself. So let me look into and research where some of those might be and like what they are, because I needed it to be on the internet. And so I spoke to a lot of people, and that was like a lot of research and investment and time went in before we picked the PIMS that we ended up picking. But the second one was like, I'm like, I could do something with this. Like, even if I need to just text them every single month, like myself, I'll do it. Because to me, that was like dollars in the door. See, if that person didn't go in and like actually give their medication and go through the entirety of like, their dosage, like, the proper amount that we had given to them, then I was losing out on revenue. Now, somebody who might be a pet parent is watching it. Well, that's kind of like a cynical way of like putting it or saying it. And I'm like, you know what? I agree. It probably might be. But to me, that was my lifeline, right? That's my lifeblood in that sense, right? This is the only thing that like is bringing in income. And it's not just for me alone. It's for my entire family. So yes, am I going to profit off of you being a better pet parent by making better decisions for your dog? Of course. But that's what I'm hoping is going to happen, is that you don't feel like I'm just stealing from you or taking money from you, that I'm doing this at your benefit and I'm providing you a service that of course is valuable. And we don't need to dive down, like, the depth of capitalism and there are things like that or whatnot. But that was the intention behind it, was like, I was extremely motivated because, it was my family's financial future. That was like, in jeopardy in a sense, but also because I knew that all of our pet parents that were really compliant, like naturally on their own, like, the people that didn't need me to text them about when to give them their dog their medication, the ones that were really compliant were really, really good at ensuring that their pet stayed healthy. And that was kind of like one of like those like first steps. And I realized and recognized that there's a momentum in when you feel like, oh man, I've given like this entire like 6-month box that I've been given by my veterinarian. I've gone through it on schedule, on time. I'm on top of it with like my pet, right? That builds the momentum. You start thinking about like, making sure that they're up to date on vaccinations, actually bringing them back in for their annuals, going through the blood work, doing the recommendations, just the start, right? Just giving one pill really like is what's starting a lot of that. And you see it even inside of the evidence. And so what I did was I hacked together a solution to automate it, because as we got more clients, from the way that like, the way that we were able to grow and expand was to really keep things very personal in the beginning with a lot of our clients, right? Like making sure that we spent a lot of time with them, that they felt heard. But, the more and more bigger you get, the harder it is to do. So we try to strive a balance to this day, and it's difficult to do that. But I hacked together like a solution basically using like Zapier at the time, which is just, hey, I would take this data set and be like, this is however many I sold, like, today, these are the list of all those people and here's their phone numbers. Every single month, just text them to give it. And then based on each inventory code and each inventory like line item, like if I sold them a 3-month pack or a 6-month pack or a 1-year pack, it was how long it was like there to be set for. And then the last message would be like, hey, like, this is your last dose that you have to give. Fluffy, for example, make sure that you go back to your veterinarian or come back to Deerwood and like, get your next set of medication. Would be the case. And so that was like automating something for myself that was like really time consuming for me to do. And I was using my personal phone, and I just would get bombarded by like, people texting me about like questions about like their pet, which I'm just like, right. Like it was starting to invade my life, and I wasn't able to have good boundaries then either. And so that was kind of one of those other issues and whatnot. So that happened. And a lot of it was like around like, me trying to figure out solutions like that. So getting creative and coding some of them on my own by learning how to code, and then learning how to use some of these applications and these tools, and then like going out to do it. Then the other was also by like understanding like where should the money get invested in terms of like what company should I be looking to partner with in terms of purchasing what their product is that they're offering, or their application, or whatever might be the case. I didn't know that that was an actual role or a job inside of like a function. And that was like what product management was every time I saw a problem that I was experiencing, I would look towards how can I solve that? And, you had a lot of problems but you got to prioritize which ones are the most important ones to solve. And so for me,
Yeah.
like, in our business that's young and fledgling and it's growing, I was over indexing on what I would say is financial related problems in terms of revenue generating problems that I could then look to solve. And so that's where my headspace was at a little bit. There were other things, right? Like, could I have like focused more on savings? Absolutely. We were at a point in time where like just natively we had to be like very like cost conscious.
Yeah.
We couldn't afford to waste money in that sense. And so we tried not to, or we didn't. And so I would always be focused on like, hey, what can I do that's going to help either give more time back to me or to my dad, or that's going to help us generate more revenue. And so that's what I was looking to do. And eventually, the long and short of it ended up becoming is that, I was talking to one of these companies and they're just like, like, you really need to talk to our product team. You have a lot of good ideas. And I'm like, product team, what's that? What's product management?
Yeah.
Like, what is that whole thing? That's when I realized like, oh, like, that's the case. Of like, oh, this field exists. And it was interesting and it was cool. And I wasn't thinking about leaving when I first heard of it. But then in 2021 is kind of when I decided. We were like, about 4 years in business at that time. COVID really, there was a massive boom inside of like the veterinary space. A lot of people got pets during that time. And we at the time had a cloud PIM, right? And so like we had just onboarded ourselves onto what was called eVet Practice, now called Pulse, the company that I now work for. Covetrus owns that product as well. But at the time, like, it was called eVet, and so we just got, and we were able to actually still take appointments and things like that, right? Because we had availability in that sense. Like, we weren't as busy in the past as some of the other veterinarians, like in our area, where they just got swamped, right? And they couldn't see people, and all of a sudden, a 15-minute appointment took 30 minutes because you were taking so many precautions with cleaning things and making sure that people were safe. Like, in that environment, you couldn't just stop going to your veterinarian if your dog was sick just because there was a virus spreading around. You had to leave your house to get them. But we had availability, and it was just by, I will say that is probably one of the luckiest times in a sense. And I don't want to downplay the fact that the pandemic was horrible and it was a tragedy, but from a business perspective, to be available and to have the availability for people to come see you as well during that time, and then to also have this random factor of where everyone started to get pets that we had like no external control over, right? It was luck, like, essentially from what resulted in us being able to substantially grow the value of the business and also the revenue then following as well. And effectively has kind of been securing my dad's retirement, or my parents' retirement, both my dad and my mom, since. And that was one of those things where it's like, you don't ever predict something like that's going to happen. It just happened and you were in the position to capitalize it. That's the luck aspect that I'm kind of talking about. And yeah, and in 2021, where I felt like, okay, we have more than just family employees now, right? There's other people that are here as well. Like, they're on payroll, they're expected to be there. My dad is actually home for dinner now, right? Which was one of the mandates that my mom had after it. She was just like, I'm tired of eating dinner without you, which I get, right? Like, you come from a Pakistani family too. Your mom would have the same complaint if your dad never was home for dinner and was just out to work all the time, right? Because they want family dinners, like, and it's a thing, right? Like, I get it. And I do appreciate my mom for calling him out on it. Otherwise, he would have never, ever thought to invest in something like Pulse at the time, or eVet at the time, sorry, that would allow him to be able to write records from home. She didn't mind the fact that he was doing work when he was at home, but she just wanted him to be there for like dinner, right? And it's cute, but it's also like, hey, like, you need to like, yeah. And then that's when I started to look towards other companies at the time. I think inside of the veterinary industry space, I knew that I'll say probably on average anywhere across this industry in the vet space, it's like 5 years behind human healthcare in my mind, especially in terms of the technology that's out there inside of human healthcare and the things that you can do and things that are available. I knew that it was ripe for innovation and it was ripe for disruption as well. And I wanted to work at a company that, like, I could learn that craft a little bit of product management in like a little bit more of a traditional sense. That's when I started at VetSource at the time and was working there. And then now, after a few years, from after like a yearish there, some months in between, and was able to be lucky enough to land at where I'm at here at Covetrus, and it's been a wonderful, I'll say wonderful job, because I can see the impact on people who are like my dad, And not in the sense of like, they're like independent business owners all the time either. Like in the sense of just like, hey, this is a veterinarian or this is a technician or somebody that's just working there. And we were able to make their life easier by like, utilizing the power of technology and of software to either automate a process or automate some sort of workflow or something for them. And all of a sudden they now feel like they have more time back in their day to do something that they want to do. So that kind of gives them like this empowering feeling. Now, are we a perfect company? By all means, no. But that being said, we have the right intentions and we are going out there to try to make sure that all of the decisions that we make are in the best interests of, our, I'll say our number one customers, which are vets and vet techs. So, but that's kind of the long of how I ended up where I am in my journey throughout.
That's honestly, it's been a journey. And I think, funny enough, I feel like you called me when you were about to leave your hospital job. And you're like, is this the right decision? And I was like, if it makes sense, you should do it. And even if it doesn't make sense, you should do it because you're serving your parents. Because you and I were raised in that same way that for us, family was everything, right? And I said to you, I was like, even if it's a detour, I think that the long of it, it will lead you down to where you need to go, not where you want to be. And look at you now. Like, I mean, it's so different. And you probably, if you asked yourself 8 years ago, I would be in product management. You probably were like, what? Are you okay? But you're here now and you're thriving and you're doing great. And honestly, I can't wait till you next pivot. Like, because I can just see your journey just slowly changing and pivoting. And I think you're one of the few people that I know or have the privilege of knowing is that you're okay to change and you pivot. And once you pivot, you excel at that pivot. So kudos to you. And honestly, like, it's very cool to like see and hear about your journey because I think young people nowadays they graduate with the bachelor's degree or an associate's degree, whatever they have, and they stick to that one job and they don't evolve, they don't change, they don't want to leave the comforts of taking risk, and they just get stuck in a dead end job which doesn't challenge them and they get bored of it. And I think it's unfortunate because if you don't challenge yourself and you don't evolve and you don't explore other fields, then for the rest of your life you stay stagnant. And I think you're a good example of someone that the moment that you feel disengaged with your work or your passion, you're like, okay, where do I go from here and how can I tackle the next problem? And so
Yeah.
I think that's huge.
No, I really appreciate those words. They're really kind, and I echo that sentiment too a little bit, right? Where if you don't feel
Mhm.
like you're being challenged with what it is that you're doing, and not
Mhm.
challenged in the sense of like it's stressing you out, but like
Yeah.
you feel like you're growing or you feel like you're learning something, then yeah, you're not going to enjoy what it is that you do, and you might get up and find yourself in like 5, 10 years where it's just like, oh crap, I don't really
Yeah.
like this, and then you're too afraid to change because it's built so much stability like inside of
Mhm.
your life or whatnot that taking a risk is becomes much harder for sure.
Yeah. And I think COVID might have awakened something in people where they started to realize that the work environment causes burnout, it causes stress, a lot of tiredness. And I think not everybody, but a good majority of people are like, what can I do to change from this? And burnout is a real thing. It's especially prevalent in healthcare. Whether you're a physician, a dentist, a surgeon, auxiliary staff, at management, it exists. Even in business, it exists, but we don't talk about these things. And I think mental health, which I hope we'll touch on today a little bit, is a key factor and a very nuanced point that this generation has started to bring to the forefront because our previous generations, like your father, my father, they're like, there's no such thing as depression. There's no such thing as not loving what you do. You just do it because you're earning money, it's stable. But our generation's like, no, 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 this is a thing. We got to address this. And if we don't pivot, we'll burn out and we'll just hate what we do, and that's not good, you know?
Yeah, you're actually like you're absolutely right. Um, this whole idea of like mental health is really pervasive, especially in like the veterinary community because they have the
Mhm.
number one suicide rate amongst like all professions. And it's actually one that I think about quite a bit because it's a hypothesis, so it's definitely not something that I can. And there's no way that I can prove this out either. But I'll explain or share the hypothesis with you.
Mhm.
Is that I feel like poor patient outcomes typically tend to come from not being able to spend enough time with the patient and with the client. And in the healthcare field, in the veterinary field, in the dentistry field, it is really difficult to do that.
Mm.
right? Because you have a lot of processes and a lot of other things that you're then required to do that aren't necessarily from treating. So where you might hope that you're having a 50-50 split of like, okay, 50% of the time I'm with patients, the other 50% of the time I'm writing records, fighting with an insurance company, justifying my case or whatever, etc. The other things. So like you would hope that that's the ideal thing. That's not, right? I honestly think it's like 15%, 85%. 15% of your time goes towards actually seeing a patient or feeling like you've been present with the patient. And the other 85 is like on all of the other stuff that, when you look at the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule of like, like 20% of the stuff will yield about 80% of those results. Yeah, like it's probably pretty accurate. So am I like quoting that? Yeah. But the hypothesis I was mentioning was that because you're not able to spend enough time with those patients, it's really what's leading to not being able to have great relationships with clients. And what I mean by that is that we refer to a patient inside of the veterinary space as the actual animal that's being treated, and refer to the client as the pet parent that's effectively administering that treatment or is in guide of like, being the shepherd of that treatment. It's sad that we bog them down with inefficient tools and inefficient processes that they feel like they're spending so much time on other things that they're just back to back to back, back to back to back, back to back to back. I'll give you an example from my dad's life too. He was working for a corporate practice at the time, and the person that came in, they couldn't afford the treatment. It was a treatable that the pet had, right? It was something that he has done before. To give you the example of what it was pyometra. Pyometra is effectively an infection of the uterus, right? And so it becomes so infected that it ends up like bursting, and then you go into sepsis after that, and the dog passes away. It's common in pets that are unspayed, right? Especially in dogs that haven't been spayed, and that's why they promote spays and neuters quite a bit. And so she couldn't afford that, but what she could afford was to euthanize the pet. And so it's a pricing structure, right? It's a pricing like issue at the end of the day. It's a cost thing. And he wasn't like, he's like, I could do the surgery for you, but I'm going to have to charge you this much in order to do it because I don't dictate the price. And she was like, well, I can't afford that. I've got to put the dog down. I don't want it to suffer, which is a valid, alternative in my mind, right? Because you're putting it between a rock and a hard place. And that's like a dilemma that you're in. You don't want to see your pet suffer. You don't want them to just die naturally, right? So you're like, if I can't, treat you, then yeah, I want to ease it as much as possible. And so my dad was reluctant about having to do something like that, but he's like, you know what, just think it over, right? And go from there. So the lady leaves and she's in the parking lot, actually, and my dad like walks out, and like he was going to lunch like as his break, and he just overhears like somebody crying. So he's like, wait, what's going on? He didn't know it was the same lady. And she's like, I can't, she's like, she's crying over the fact that like, she has to put her dog down. She's like talking to her dog. Like you can tell that she has a really like special relationship with her pet here. And she's like, I can't believe I have to put you down because like, like I couldn't afford to do X, Y, Z or whatever might have been the case. Right. And so he was like in a position where he felt really like, I'll say stuck, but he also didn't like it at all. Because he knew that if it was his own place, he'd be like, whatever, I'll give it to you at cost because you are a nice enough person and you really care about that dog, right? And you're more than willing to go above and beyond to make sure it gets taken care of well, right? He saw the intention that was there, right? And this is like, I'm saying this is hours after like he had seen her in the morning. Like, he saw her first thing in the morning because she was an emergency. And then he goes in and he's like, okay, well, he asked their office manager at the time, like, can I pay for the surgery? Like I'll like just like let me pay for it, and they're like, no, you can't do that. It's against our policies, which is I right, maybe it didn't make sense to me at the time, but being on the other side of it, I get, right, because then you obviously don't want your employees to be exploited financially or anything like that either, right? And so it's a policy that's well intentioned in terms of the idea of protection. So he just kind of was like, okay, that's fine. So he went to his car and like he just like had cash with him and then like drove to the ATM, I guess, to cover up the difference of whatever it was that he was missing, and like walked over to the lady and just gave her the envelope and was like, here you go, but this didn't come from me, and then walked back inside. The lady comes in and she it's like, hey, all of a sudden I can pay for the surgery. So they're like, okay, go ahead, like we'll book it or whatever, right? And that's what it was for the corporate. He came home that day and he was like pissed, and he was just like, I never want to be in that position ever again. And that's kind of what prompted him to want to start his own place, because he's like, if I can do it, then it's my time, it's my effort, and they wouldn't let me do it at cost or whatever. So I'll go ahead and I'll do this. And, like to this day, like we still try to do as much charitable work like that we can, especially with patients. Obviously, we're not able to do that with everybody. So, but yeah, that's kind of where it is. And again, he was able to make that decision because he was able to find the time to spend with that client, to really understand and to really empathize with them and to get what their situation was, and then was able to be like, okay, I'll go ahead and do it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every veterinarian in the world should just pay out of their own pocket to do treatments or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I am suggesting is that if you are able to spend more times with your clients, especially early on, and you're able to build a much better, they're more likely and more inclined as a pet parent is going to be able to take that advice that you're giving to them, right? Because now they feel like they have a relationship and a bond with you. And when they are making the right decisions and you feel like they're making the decisions that don't go against the best interests and health of that pet, which I'm sure you've seen in dentistry, right? Somebody's got a cavity and they're like, no, doc, I'm not going to go fill it up or anything like that. Like, I'm going to let it sit there. And then they come back months later and they're just like, what happened? Now the whole tooth's got to get gone, or maybe like, 2 or 3 along with it. Right. And that's what I'm like trying to get at, is that like you might not have the amount of time when you're there with them to be able to do that. And think about what that does to a person, especially in the vet industry, where it's like you look at these animals and they are absolutely, totally at the mercy of who it is that is taking care of them and that financial situation that person's in. And most people in America aren't in the best financial situation. I think we've talked about it in the past before, but how many people can really afford like, $1,000 surgery for their pet?
They can't.
Yeah, without putting it onto a credit card or something like that, right? Like without dipping into or some line of credit as a result.
Mm-hmm.
And you're kind of like sitting there, and then it's just like you see that, and that those types of decisions that compound over days. And then those people that are coming in there with these pets, and they have these pets because these pets obviously give them some joy in their life. Like, I'm not saying like don't have a pet, as like right, if you're like completely and totally broke or something like that. Is it the most recommended decision? No, but like, you need to start thinking about it from the perspective of like you are now responsible for another being, and to make the right choices to then take care of that being. But they do bring people joy. They do bring them some sort of happiness. They do bring them some sort of like grounding and structure. A lot of people have these great relationships with their pets, and they tie so much of their own worth in being able to take care of that pet, that when they're not able to do it, the first thing that most people do, because they don't have good controls of managing emotions, they lash out at the person in front of them. And that's almost always the veterinary provider or the veterinary technician that's in front of them. Yeah. And that's really tough. And you think, right, like you think of all the times that you've interacted with that person, and like, what could I have given them? Could I have advised them a little bit better? Could I have done X, Y, Z in the past? Like, if I had more time with them to tell them, don't do this, go down this thing, like the butterfly effect starts to reverse back inside of your own head and being like, if I said this, would this have turned out differently from an outcomes perspective? But you can't get that back, right? Because it's in the past. And that's the unfortunate part. And I think that's where the whole mental health struggle comes from, is that a lot of people aren't able to really cope with that, from like being able to cope with it from the provider's perspective of actually dealing with those types of situations, and then separating themselves from somebody else's emotional anger that is then being let out on them. And then the second part of it is that those people, those pet parents that are in those positions, whatever they might be that's stressing them out, right? You might not be the reason. It might be the pet, like, like that's the triggering point, that like, the tipping point, in a sense of like that set them off the edge of like whatever it is that you said, but you're not the reason for it. I think that's where the dichotomy of mental health in both the clinician and the patient and client in this case is, is really important. Is that if you're not taking care of it, you're not going to be able to make the most or the best decisions. And anything that happens that, a one-off instance, sure, you can recover from, but something like that compounds over time, that you're seeing multiple times a day, over months, over years, it eats away at you. And that's what's the unfortunate part, is that you think you're starting to do a bad job. You start doubting yourself quite a bit as a result of that. And yeah, you fall into these types of issues where you might have depression, or worst case scenarios where, somebody ends up taking their own life. That's because they just couldn't handle it. And yeah, it's sad, it's unfortunate, and I think that's why protecting your own mental health is key, but also having the necessary tools inside of your own pocket to be able to deal with those types of situations, to be able to come with some level of grace from those types of situations is also extremely important if you're on the clinical facing side.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, man. Like, I would say when you talk like veterinary and like clinicians having like high suicide rates, I know for a long time dentistry was number one too. For a long time. I don't know if it still is, but it's up there. Like dentistry, vet, I'm sure even physician rates at some point were pretty high. I don't know. I'm unsure. But it's the unfortunate part because, you do all of these things. Like you study so hard in professional school, but mental health is never covered. Business is never covered. The other like 80% of what matters isn't covered. They just teach you enough to not kill a person or a pet or providing adequate services. And I think that's something that like it bothers me because I love to teach and I wish we would have more of an open conversation in schools and as a society in general to talk about like the importance of these things because the more closed book it is, the more taboo it is and I think it leads to worse overall outcomes. I think our generation is starting to do a better job of it, but it's still not there. Social media is a good generating factor, I think. However, my biggest concern, and I don't like social media too much, use it as a leverage tool. I always have. But people tend to glamorize and curate the content. I think you were the one that told me this years ago, if I remember correctly. However, how you choose to use social media in terms to address this type of issue I think that's going to be the pivotal factor as we move forward in the future. Like personally, I talk about like mental health struggles and other things because I want to grow and build not a society, but a following that talks about openly about these things as a clinician and for people that are not clinicians, like patients and pet parents. Because as we continue to talk about these topics and things, I feel like we can come up with better solutions as well. And whatever those solutions might be. I don't know. I'm not that type of person to come up with every solution, but I think what you talked about and what you mentioned about that whole aspect, it's big. And corporations, unfortunately, it's a big thing in medicine. They've pretty much taken over along with private equity. I mean, physician autonomy is probably at an all-time low. Dentistry's kind of heading that way. We're probably about 20 years. I'm not sure about vets, but I'm sure you guys are probably similar to dentistry. You're a little bit still behind. But at some point in America, healthcare will be PE, and I think it's going to lead to a lot more physician and clinician struggles. And so these type of topics, albeit taboo currently, need to be talked about because we will have conflicting issues with management. And
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I have a friend. I have like two friends who are pharmacists, and one is in
Mhm.
industry and one is about to graduate. They were talking, and I was overhearing a conversation with them, right? And none of them were ever keen on their times at retail pharmaceuticals like CVS, Rite Aids, like stuff like that,
Mhm.
right? Like I'm not calling a particular company out or anything like that. I'm just saying, like,
Yeah.
those are the types of pharmacies that, like, you're interning at, you're trying to gain experience or whatever, like, maybe have like some sort of thing in. But they both really did not like their experiences there.
Mm.
It was almost always down to the fact that they're people
Yeah.
the people that they're dealing with, right? And it's really sad because they're really talented. Those two are sharp. Like, they're really sharp individuals. They're extremely talented. They're driven. They're motivated. They're like type A's, like achievers and things like that. And they choose not to be in a place where they could have the most amount of societal impact
Yeah.
because of society themselves, ironically, and they'd rather just go to industry because
Yeah.
it's a much easier path for them in terms of
Yeah.
being able to protect their own headspace,
Mm.
flexibility with their time, etc., etc. And this is like, we're already in a shortage of like physicians, and dentists, and veterinarians. And you're right, that is going towards the private equity route as well. We're already in a shortage of this. These jobs just seem to become more and more unattractive over
Hmm.
time as a result of it. And like, if it was already hard enough because you had to have some sort of passion or some sort of calling that you felt to go into something like healthcare in the like
Hmm.
from the first place, it's like difficult enough now that like, oh hey, the people that you're dealing with are extremely crappy, and like you have to figure out a way to work through that. Like if you're, I think it's a vested interest if you're in private equity for your long-term outlook to figure out solutions that enable or help your employees better deal with them, like when they are like in front of difficult people or in front of these difficult types of situations. But will they? I'm very skeptical that they will.
Yeah.
I think there's a very conscious impact investing wave that's around, that's been there. Like a lot of people are investing into like green technologies and things like
Yeah.
that to be able to keep the earth alive. I really wish that there was something like that at least would be in front of my eyes. I'm sure there is, but that's around the impact investing of about how to help the mental health of clinicians specifically, and not just like, all right, here's a space where you can talk with like a therapist or something like that. Most of these people probably don't really have enough time to do that, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Because when they go to work, they're focused, they're lasered in, and then when they're home, they try to leave all of that stuff at the door, so they don't want to bring it back up again usually. But yeah, like about giving them the tools to be able to like, hey, like here's how you should deal with difficult patients if the time comes. Here's how to separate yourself from the emotional. Here's how to separate your emotional outcomes from the actual healthcare outcomes, from decisions that you've made inside of like clinical care, to better give you the ability to work more effectively, but also to better be able to give you the ability to go back home to your family and actually be the best version of yourself. I think it's a virtuous cycle. It'll continue to necessitate itself, right? Like it'll continue to propagate. Like the better you are at work, the better the outcomes that then come up. You feel good about that. You go back home. You bring that energy with you home. Your family is then energized as a result, and whoever it is that they're then interacting with in that day to day that's moving on forward continues to feel the effects of those positive things. It takes one negative person to derail that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you hit it on the head, and it's very interesting, and I hope that someone will, or maybe it just becomes more of an open discussion.
Mm-hmm.
That's the biggest thing, and I think it's a big need. I mean, I see it. People like, I mean, I peruse Reddit from time to time, and there's always like these like new grads, and I'm a relatively new grad. I love what I do. It's a passion for me. Do I get sick of it sometimes? Yeah, absolutely. There's some really ridiculous patients out there and people, but that's people. People come in all types of flavors, but majority of them are grateful. But to my point on Reddit, you see these new grads in dentistry. I'm sure it's in medicine too, but like, I graduated in 22, 23, 21, 20, and I hate what I do. It sucks. And I'm like, well, and I'll type up like, hey, like if you don't like it, then why did you do it? And I ask in a nice way, as an inquisitive way. It's like, why did you do it? And if it's not what you thought it would be, then take some courses or go specialize or do something different to figure out what you love about the profession and do it over and over. Because if you hate it and you're this early on, then you took a big loan from the government or private, or if you were lucky enough that it was paid for, you are in trouble because you have to find out a way to pay all of that back. And that is not easy without having the craft, because your craft ends up paying for that debt that you took out to become a physician or a doctor or surgeon or
Yeah.
whatever you might.
Yeah,
So,
you mentioned that, right? Like, hey, you've got student loans and things like that, and like let's go back to even just that point of if you're like a clinician or something, right? And like
mhm,
you had mentioned, like they don't teach you how to operate a business. Now
yeah,
you're a dentist in like some like rural town or something like that. No corporate is going to come knocking on your door to buy you out. You're going to start your own thing, right? Because you're trying to serve the
mhm,
people that you're there for. Ultimately, why you got into it is
yeah,
to be a servant of some of these people, or to help them, to assist them, to aid them. And even with veterinarians, like that's the thing, they don't teach you how to do that. And so you have pressures that come from you from even that aspect. We've only just talked about what seems to be like an insurmountable amount of just pressure on just the actual like patient client and like clinician relationship that's there,
yeah,
right? That's just
yeah,
the medical side of things. There's the whole operational side that
yeah,
like isn't, you're just like, holy crap, like what do you do? Like I see it in my dad even today, like where I learned how to be a really good operator in
Mm.
business from him, right? And especially from like with the clinic, I learned how to be a really good operator with that in terms of just like, things like where you can find efficiencies, not necessarily just in people, but in processes that exist and like being able to negotiate rates and et cetera and things like that. Like, like that's like, I've really enjoyed being an operator in a business.
Mm.
And for some people, like they're passionate about it and they'll learn how to do something like that. But others aren't invested into that side of it at all, but feel like they have to do that side. And it's such a laborious side for them. Like it takes away their time. Like to them, the craft, the passion, the energy is all in the clinical side. And the clinical side sucks. Now they got to go to this type of side on the operational end where they have to be an operator and they already don't like that. And that has
Yeah.
a large list of challenges on its own. You're thinking about how do I get rent paid? I got to do like a ST3 form for my sales tax. Like, what the hell is this? Like, like what I mean, right? Like, all these things that are like coming up, like they're just like, oh, like they don't teach you these types of things when they say, oh, you should go own a practice or you should go do this or something like that, right? That's also coming up, and you're just like, it surmounts. It feels like it's overwhelming and that
Hmm.
like that you're right, if there isn't one aspect of the profession that you enjoy that you can't hone in on, adding the idea of like I have a multi-$100,000 figure student loan debt in the back of my head, yeah, like it's not a fun spot to be in, because then you just feel like you're there and you feel trapped, and I think that's when people make some of their mistakes or some of the decisions that they do. They feel like they're trapped, there's no way out. It's unfortunate, but yeah.
And that's why the saying is business is hard. And people are like, oh, what do you mean business is hard? Business is hard. It is not easy. There's so many facets. And it's not like you said, it's not multiple facets. It's one big facet with different faces. But it is one, and it will just drown you if you're not careful and you don't navigate it with, I guess, uninterrupted optimism. Because I think, as you've talked about your story, it's your enthusiastic optimism that got you through that phase. But if you didn't have it, you would probably be like, yeah, what the heck is all this nonsense?
Yeah. You're sitting there and you're sitting there, you're wondering like, man, why did I do this in the first place? Like, I thought it'd be a good idea. Like, I'm in business to make money and like I'm not making money and my life sucks. Like, like
Yeah.
that's right. You're just like, ah, crap. What do you
Oh,
do at that
crap.
point? And that's the unfortunate part of it too, is that these difficult things sometimes have a long-term ROI. Like there were days at the clinic we didn't make a single dollar. Single dollar.
Mm.
No one came in. And it's like the phone didn't ring, like, right? And so I'm just sitting there twiddling thumbs with like, talking with my dad. I'm like, what are we gonna do, right? There's not a single person out there that would like bother to walk in through the doors. You'd see people
Mm.
walk by because we were in a strip mall at the time before we opened up our own location, like where it's a standalone facility. So I'd see
Mm.
people go walking left towards the Richest Carpet one, which is like a carpet store that was on our left hand side. Those people were fantastic. They're wonderful. They're great neighbors to us. And then I see people walking towards the right on towards Geico and towards H&R Block, right? Like get your taxes done or get your insurance stuff like taken care of as well. And so like I would see that like left, right. No one's like coming in, and it really gets to you because you start thinking that like you're a failure at what it is that you're doing, and like to have like the sheer shrapnel to fight through that is it's hard because
It's
you
tough.
just don't think you have momentum at that point, and you really
Yeah.
don't, right? Like especially early on, you don't, and you rely more on making longer celebrations of your small victories than you
Mm.
do the sheer number of wins that you are then getting as you're like later in business or whatever might be the
Yeah.
case. But it's tough and it's really easy to lose sight of.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So, okay, so we touched on mental health, and I think that's something that I want to continue to kind of explore, but also kind of add the fitness aspect. So, funny enough, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember this. But I think maybe 8, 9 years ago, I came to your house. You kind of showed me around your house, and you had a barn in the back of your old house at Penn State. And you're like,
Mm-hmm.
come with me. I'm going to show you something. And I'm like, all right. So we climb up your roof, and you're like, it was a big giant, was it oak tree or tree? I don't remember. It was a big tree,
Yeah.
massive. And you're like, Ahad, we're just gonna sit here and just relax and not say a word to each other. And I'm like, what are we doing? And he's like, have you ever meditated? And I'm like, no. I was like, what is this? He's like, just try it. And we just sat there for 5, 10, 15 minutes, didn't say a word to each other. And you're like, hey, how do you feel? And I'm like, This is awesome, dude. Like the wind was blowing, it was nice and sunny. And it's like one of my like best memories of you and I just hanging out. And I was like, I really like this. And so I think I've continued that practice, by the way. To this day I still do it. Not all the time, but every couple of days or every other day I'll do it. Besides, prayer as a practicing Muslim. But I think meditation and mental health, it's a nice crux. And I think we should touch on that. And I also kind of want to talk to you about your fitness journey because at some point you became a marathon runner or an endurance runner. I can't remember exactly which one, but I would love for you to kind of dabble on those topics.
Yeah, sure. So, we've always been able to connect with like spirituality quite a bit
Yeah.
because like again, I'm really deeply grounded in my faith, right? As a Hindu, as like a Swaminarayan Hindu, like that's like my that's my faith, right? And in some aspect and in some regard, I think it's extremely important to have some level of spirituality inside of your life. And I don't mean you got to believe in a particular god or anything like that. I think you just need to have a way where you feel like you can connect with the earth, with nature, with the rest of the world, with the ever growing conscious of the people, so to speak. Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that like it's a really good practice to have in general, even if you don't believe in an entity in particular or ascribe to a particular religion because of whatever personal beliefs that you may hold. There's nothing wrong with that. And that is a really good bedrock and a foundation for having like good mental health in my mind. There's by and large in everything that you do a large degree of faith that goes around with it, right? We talk about I think we talked about this idea that of the God of the gaps once. It wasn't what we termed it at the time, but it was like everything that science can explain is here, and the stuff that science can't explain is here, and that's where God is, right? And like that's the gap. And like as science continues to go older, it's like okay, all right, like like that, like the gap tends to shorten, and then you start looking at other things, and like that's the idea, like the whole God of the gaps. Right? God is where like science is not able to explain certain things yet.
Bingo.
I personally ascribe to the belief that maybe science is the way that God does things, and we are slowly unraveling and like figuring out how that's working. And now, do we have all of the answers? Absolutely not. And some people who are a lot more theocratic than me might be like, well, like you should really have 100% faith. Okay, you're welcome to your opinion. I try to live my life a little bit more pragmatically than that. So there's some balance that I look to strive for, and this is the balance that works for me. And I think everybody needs to take a look at themselves and have that type of conversation of like, what is that balance that then strikes for me? Am I more indexed on faith versus science, or am I more indexed on science versus faith? But understand and recognize that you need both in order to have a healthy bedrock just for life in general. Right. And that's like the first foundation or the key in my mind towards a solid like mental health, like an ability to be able to really cultivate true resilience, true grit can come from that. There is a great amount of comfort that I do take in the fact that knowing that the struggles and the pains that like I may go through in my day-to-day life or like throughout my time here that is on this earth, that it is not necessarily insurmountable or something that I can't overcome without my God at my side and him being able to drive open and cut open the paths that may be there. Like, to give you an idea and to give you an example, when you're going out and you're getting a job, whether or not someone says yes to you, you can influence so much in whatever is inside of your direct control, but ultimately the decision lies within who? Somebody else. And I think that whatever the tipping point is that lands it into your favor, that gets you the job, in my mind, that is God working his way and working through me in order to be able to bring about that outcome. Yeah. And so there's that, right? So there's a lot of grace that I try to lead my life with because, there's things that like I don't have fundamental control over and it's not in my hands. So anything that I can control over, I try to in terms of my direct effort. Something that I can't, you leave up to him who is almighty. And sorry, I think you disconnected for a set, but you leave it up to him who is almighty. Now, the fitness aspect that then comes in is like, there was an idea to like wanting to just challenge myself a little bit. But there was like a quote from like, I think it was Socrates or something that I just like read, like I happened across. And it got me really thinking, like, like the man who doesn't know what his body is capable of will never know, like, right? Like, and so if you don't ever try, then you'll never find out just exactly what it is that you're able to achieve. And I also saw that fitness was a key trait, like, having some sort of discipline and practice. I'm not saying that like everyone that's been successful has had a six pack in their life. Far from it, right? Like most of these people
Far from.
probably didn't, but they probably had a consistent discipline or a practice of where maybe they walked a lot, or that they were very conscious about, like, going to the gym to eat healthy, to do XYZ, whatever might be the case. They did take the time to try to take care of themselves to some regard. And so that was one trait that I saw. And then the other part of fitness is also is a really great enabler for you to just be able to do things in general, right? And like, if I wanted to, like, be able to stay up an extra hour to to continue working late into the night, if I have a crappy diet, if I have a crappy lifestyle, being able to focus for that hour on work or whatever it is that I would want it to do in that time becomes progressively more difficult, right? Now I have the niceties of youth on my side a little bit, but if I was like 40 or 50 years old, I don't, and if I haven't taken care of myself, how am I actually going to be able to do XYZ? So there was that too. And so those were the things that kind of like really inspired me to want to like do something about fitness, and then like to do just anything that might be the case. And in college, I took a course on running, because I think you had to take like one fitness course or something like that.
You did.
If I remember correctly, and that was the one that I took. And I really enjoyed it at the time, but I never like stuck with it. And I thought, you know what? I saw some statistic that like, only a certain amount of the world's population are like marathon runners. And I was like, it'd be really cool if I could be a part of that population, because then I could look at that as an achievement of like what I'm capable of physically, right? And I can like rely on that. At the end of the day, if you don't have anything to yourself, you have your body's achievements, right?
Yep.
So like you can at least like be proud on that. And you had mentioned this to me once too, is that like you really loved people who took care of themselves or were into fitness, because it showed that they had a level of self-love for themselves to be able to go out there and invest the time within themselves. And yes, you're improving in a vast amount of ways, right? And if you're doing something because you want the aesthetics of how you look to like improve as a result of it, that's totally fine too. I think whatever can get you to get started is great. Don't necessarily have that almost always be the motivation that keeps you going. You'll find more reasons to continue to do it, and you just have to continue to remind yourselves of that. And if not, go back to where you started, because that's what got you started. And yeah, and that's why I really started running. And as I was running, the weird part about this is, I'm not going to say weird, it's just I never expected this when I started. How about that? As I started running, my faith got immensely stronger as a byproduct or as a result of it. And why did that happen? Well, let me tell you. It was because I was listening to not only just like podcasts and things like that, but I was also taking some time to listen to like some spiritual discourses as well. I didn't want to just listen to music the entirety of it. I didn't want music to fuel me. I wanted my own body and my own mind to be able to fuel me as well. So I would listen to these things, and I would hear of the struggles that like my gurus have gone through. And I would try to like picture that while I was on my run. I'd almost always forget the fact that like, my lungs were like, screaming for air. My legs were getting heavier, my knees were hurting or something like that, whatever might be the case, like, whatever pain that I was experiencing at that time. I just forget about it, and I just think about that. And I would think to myself that like, man, like I'm trying to put myself in his shoes, and he is like, in his 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s, he's going through all this. And here I am complaining about a 5K. What a privileged position in my life that I am in.
Yep.
Right. And you mentioned it earlier too, right? If you're not ever going to seek some level of discomfort in your life, then you're never really going to challenge yourself to grow. And frankly speaking, if you live in this country, regardless of your thoughts on how it is at this current state, you're a pretty privileged person.
Yes.
Right. You have a lot of opportunity. You have a lot of access. It may not feel that way, but compared to other places and other areas in the world, there's almost always going to be somebody that has it worse off than you do. And so that's the one thing. And so I was just like, hey, like, I am out here, I'm challenging myself because I need to challenge myself in order to continue to grow. But more because I need to validate and to justify the sufferings of the people that came from before me in the past, that it was worth it for them. There's a quote that goes something like, old men, plant trees whose shade that they never will sit under, and that's how like society progresses. And that's exactly what my gurus did for me. That's what my parents have done for me, right? And that's how a bunch of people that have supported me throughout the entireties of my life. Like, not only just family, but people who are friends of mine, people who are older than me that are mentors of me, people at my at my mandir, at my temple. They are the ones that have done so much, and I've indirectly benefited from the majority of what they've done. And in certain cases, I've directly benefited from them as well. But it wouldn't have been possible without them. And that's when my spirituality started to strengthen quite a bit. And it's when I really developed a relationship where I started to enjoy running, because I could take some of the time in my day to be able to reflect and to think on those types of things. So you talked about this meditation, and I was able to transform a little bit of the running to become this type of meditation where I'm not focused on that physical activity, and I'm able to actually sit back and process as I'm running, after I get to a certain point of where I can think of decisions that have gone out in my day, or things that I've thought about, or whatever might have been the case. And that was really where that enjoyment for fitness probably came, and it's continued to grow there since. Right, I'm also somebody that likes to see numbers go up or down. Heart rate go down is very good. Sitting at 44 beats per minute is awesome. I
It's
will say,
nice.
right?
It is nice.
But it's just a thing that also gives me some sort of enjoyment and some sort of motivation and fuel too. But it's short term, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember I put on a whole bunch of weight, and then and I did it just so that I could bench 135. It's probably nothing to you, but I was yes, I could probably bench 135, and I looked at
I did
myself
it,
and I'm
yeah.
oh god, I did it the wrong way. This is horrible. You know what I mean? I look like a schleb. I don't like this, right? Then I got to go back, focus on running again, and really try to attack this and approach this the right way, because right. And so there is a balance, right, where it's I'm doing this. I need to make sure I'm doing it for the right reasons, but my ego also comes into play a little bit too. And I don't think that in this case it's the wrong thing in a sense to play along with it, right? And recognize that yes, some things when I do them, it does fulfill my ego, and that's totally okay because I'm in control of that situation. I'm not letting that become overinflated as a result, because I know that there's somebody out there that can lift more than me, just as much as I know that there's somebody out there that is in a worse situation than I am, right? You're always going to have somebody above you. And even if you feel like you've made it to the top, if you have the level of faith, there is also God that is then above you. But you're
Yep.
also going to be have somebody that's almost always going to be below you as well.
Mhm.
And same thing with faith. Even if you feel like you're at the rock bottom, the devil's always down there as well.
That's a good perspective, Shailin. Honestly, and I kind of, that sentiment of faith increasing with physical fitness, and I would say it's something that I've also noticed too. I started my powerlifting and running journey, probably powerlifting was around the same time of college. I think running I picked up during COVID, surprisingly, because I couldn't go to the gym, which was interesting. And in New York City, I really challenged myself because I saw people running all the time, on the streets. I was like, why are people enjoying this? This looks horrible. But as I started to get better at it, I was like, okay, I can do 3 miles, 5 miles, 8 miles. And I actually haven't gone past 10 miles. Not because I'm just lazy. It's just, I was just like, you know what? This is where I want to be. I'm comfortable here. I think I do want to do the whole marathon thing because, like you said, it is that little percent of population that has achieved it, even though you think you hear all about it. But very few people, you'll talk to them, oh, you've done a marathon? So, oh, yeah, I've done one. People are like, whoa, that's kind of cool. So it is definitely something interesting. And, you mentioned it. It was another quote that I had read. I think it was by Ashley Horner. She's like a female powerlifter or something like that. And she said once that it doesn't matter how hard you work or how hard you train, but when you see how good you look and how good you feel, there's not one person in the world that can take that away from you. It's a signal and an indicator to others that, hey, I've worked hard for this. And there's nothing you can do in your power to take it away from me. And I think that's so powerful because it shows self discipline, it shows self love. I think it shows baseline faith in something other than just yourself. And with that, there should be honor and pride. And I think if you look at our ancestors, whether we're Pakistani, Indian, wherever, but they used to train hard, dude. They used to do manual labor, brickwork. I mean, you name it, they did it all. And we sit here and program our computers and AI, and we're nothing like these guys, man. We're complete lazy if you look at what they used to and what we do nowadays. So it's very interesting. I think it all interlocks. And I think the beauty of it all is this interlocking helps take us as humans to the next level And I think with it comes a spirituality because we start thinking that something might be impossible, but we realize we can achieve it. And something else impossible comes up, and then we achieve it again. And then we start looking around us, and we're like, well, no one else has ever done this, and I'm the greatest. But then you realize that there's someone is better than you, and you kind of are like, huh, I'm really not that great. But then you have to think and keep in mind that, hey, there's a lot of people that haven't done this either. So you got to stay humble in the process and your own journey and not compare yourself to it, and just be happy with yourself and where you are, and always strive to do more. And I think there's a beautiful aspect to all of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Man.
So that's it's interesting. But anyways, now that we've kind of covered fitness and spirituality, the last thing I'd love to pick your brain about is growing up as an Indian American in Canada and then shifting to the northeast of the United States. I'd love to get your aspect and journey on that whole thing. How's that been for you? What was it like growing up? Did you face any difficulties, etc.?
Yeah, there's always a particular moment in my mind that like sticks out in my head quite a bit.
Mm.
And it was when I was in Canada, and we used to live in the basement. It's ironically actually a Muslim couple, and they've been really good to my family. Like not just me and my parents, but like to my cousins and things like that. We still have a very strong relationship with them today. I know their kids, and they're all older now. And, they have kids as well. And we lived in the basement of their house, and I think it was in Etobicoke or something like that. But anyways, it's the greater Toronto area, Toronto for lack of a thing. But we used to live there, and then I was helping my mom out with laundry. I think I'm like this like tiny guy. Like I think I'm like 7 years old at the time or something, like 8 years old. And I'm just trying to be like like helpful or to be good. And we get to a point where it's like, oh, like we're taking my dad's underwear, and like I'm like taking this, and I'm like, oh look, like this has a hole in it. I was like, Mom, like maybe we should throw this out, like because it's got a hole in it, right? Like you can't wear
Yeah.
this. And my mom said no. She's like, no, 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 it's fine. Your dad can still wear it. And I was like, what? Like at that time, like I didn't know. One, I didn't know where the hole came from, and two, I didn't know why the hell like she even like allowed it. But I was like, okay, fine. Like like yeah, okay, dad can wear it. Like we'll go ahead and we'll do it, right? In no way was she trying to tell me that at that time, like we could not afford to even let go of like a piece of underwear because we just didn't have money together. And my dad at the time, right? Like it was weird to me because I still remember growing up a little bit where I recognized that my dad wasn't just an ordinary worker. Like he was a part of a profession, right? He was a veterinarian.
Yeah.
And I thought that that's what he did too, like when we came here. But he told me afterwards, like, around the time, like, that's not what he does. And he was actually working at a chemical company, Seneca. And what would happen is that, sometimes the chemicals spill or they burn, and, they tear through your clothing, and that's what was happened. Is that it tore through and put a hole inside of his underwear, and we couldn't afford to get new underwear at the time. But I never once wanted in my life for anything because they made so many sacrifices in order to be able to do that, and like that was one of those sacrifices. And to me, it's actually like a really important thing. And I'm sure that almost every other Indian American, Pakistani American, Bangladeshi American, any type of American that has come from an immigrant family, right? They could be Latino, they could be like, European, whatever might be the case. They probably have an experience that's like that when their parents left the country that they were from to come from a better life. And then they came to Canada or to America or wherever. And like, that was one of the things where I realized quite a bit where we may not necessarily be as privileged as some of the people who have grown up here or were born here their entire life. And you don't realize it when you're growing up. You realize it after the fact. But when you're growing up, it comes to you in the way that, well, why can't I do X, Y, Z? And sometimes parents have very direct conversations with their kids, and they tell them, well, because we can't afford something like that, or because that's not something that we value inside of our life, right? So that's why you can't do it. But my parents were very open, and even though I felt like they weren't, I learned later on that they were very open. And then they would let me go and explore. They would let me go and do these things, like, go to the school dance. Like, they're like, yeah, sure, we'll pay for the ticket or whatever. And it was like, like $30-$40 or something like that. And I don't think that we could have afforded $30-$40, right? It was right. Like that's crazy. When I think about it now, and like, if I think about if I had a kid, like I'd be like, yo, what are you doing? You crazy? Like, we're not going to do that. Like you stay at home, you help your mom, like, or something like that. Or, whatever. And yeah, and that was one of the things that like really stuck out to me was that I had a different experience, and I knew at the time that I was also living through that different of an experience because I was almost always the only like brown kid
Mm.
wherever I was. And if even if we had some other brown kids in our class, they weren't there, right? Like because like my parents continued to make sacrifices to make sure that they felt like I never was excluded from anything or that I never deserve anything. And part of people, might be thinking in their heads like, well, you're an only child, so you're just getting spoiled. Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
my circumstance. And yes, am I spoiled as an only child? I admit it. I agree. I am, right? Like if I ever wanted something, it was like a phone call away and like cool, like I might not get it immediately, but I'll eventually get it,
Mm.
right? And so it was never anything like that. And so that really made me appreciate a lot. Like that story in particular really made me appreciate a lot from like what my parents came from and to where we are now. Right? Like that whole trajectory, that one decision to come here effectively changed the entire family history for generations to come. Right. And yeah, without that, it wouldn't be possible. When we moved to America, I moved to a part in. Originally, I was living in Bucks County. I forget where in particular, but in Bucks County. And I was going to a Catholic school at the time,
Mm.
and that was because my mom and my dad wanted to make sure that I had the best education. And so
Yeah.
they didn't want to put me in the public school. And they would not ever get anything for themselves. So that way they could fund my education. So they put me into a private school, a Catholic school. I learned a lot about Christianity. I have a great respect for that religion in terms of the teachings of it, just from my time there, but also some of the people that I've been able to um, uh, have, I'd say, relationships with after growing up with them as well.
Mm.
So yeah, and so that was one of those things where it was really cool to kind of go through and to see the differences and also some of the similarities as well. But I also almost always felt like I was out of place quite a bit and trying to bridge the gap between, being Indian and being in America.
Mm.
Right. And it wasn't, I would say it wasn't challenging, but you wanted to tell guys like, that were your age that you like the same sports that they do and you'll try to fit in. So you'll try to do it in multiple ways. And whether it's trying to be, going over the top with something, right. To be like, oh, like I'm like, like if you're going to like, like make yourself look like a fool sometimes, even, um, or you try to do them by helping them because you're intelligent and you can help them with their homework or with their schoolwork or whatever, right? Like I always found myself in that position quite a bit, even when I was in high school, where it felt like I was like seeking the approval of like other people that I was with because
Mm.
I was always a minority and wanting to get the approval from a majority. And it wasn't until like I grew and went to college and like it took some time to reflect on it that those people did not like me for necessarily me wanting to try to fit in with them. They liked me because I was trying to be as authentic as I could with them.
Mm.
And I was trying to be a friend to them and I was trying to be somebody that was like, in this world as another human being with them. Right? Like I was making an effort to understand them. And effectively, it might have been just because of my desire to want to fit in, but I was still making the effort to try to understand them. And I think that's what the one thing that if I reflect on and take that lesson out then is that, or sorry, not the only thing, but one of the things is that, I made a lot of decisions back then where somebody would have been like, you're just trying to fit in that I now look back upon and look at like, I just wanted to understand the people inside of my environment and inside of my surroundings and how best I could build and cultivate a relationship with them because I was looking for friends. I think sometimes
Yeah.
we all are, right? There's a desire to
Mhm.
want to connect, to have a relationship with people. And so that was where a lot of that came from as well. And I think that's one of those challenges and the struggles that like when you are growing up as like an Indian American, if you're not totally surrounded by like other Indians. And I had friends who were Indian, right? Especially from Mandir, right? From the temple. Like, and I would see them all the time. And they had different experiences than I did because, they were in schools that were in public schools that were a lot more colored than the schools that I went to.
Mm.
And yeah, that's kind of where it all was I would say challenging in a sense for me, because some things that like they would do, I would find it weird or I'd find it embarrassing.
Hmm.
But it's also because I just also felt like I was the only person. Like in high school, we didn't have another Indian kid come into high school until I was in like my senior year, I think. And my last name is Patel, and my neighbors at the time were also Patels, and everyone thought that we were like, like my older sister went there and my older brother went there, right? And I'm just like, and I just got tired of correcting them, so I was just like, yeah, you're right. I mean, I have a great relationship with them too. Like I love, like I know them now as well. Like I still try and stay in touch and things like that. And yes, they have been there as like figures of like as older brothers and older sisters inside my life for sure. But yeah, it's just one of those things where you're just like, um, you you stop trying to correct things, you stop trying to do XYZ, all because you let a lot of things go that, reflecting upon it now, that I don't think people today would, or kids today would. And I think about it as, is it even worth it for me to hold on to something like that at that time? No. And today, if I was in that same spot, would it still even be worth it for me to like hold on to it? No. But that comes from a strong sense of self. And ultimately, I had the identity that I knew I was Indian and I was a Hindu and I was an American, right?
Mm.
And I say that, and if my wife watches this, she's probably gonna laugh, because at the time I was a Canadian citizen.
Yeah, that's
Right?
hilarious.
So she's gonna be like, "No, you weren't," and I know all my friends are probably.
You're Canadian.
But no, I really ascribed and found myself and identified myself as to be an American, because when we were talking to my dad, my dad's like, no, we're not moving out of this country. This is the last country that we're like, this is it. Like, this was the goal to get to, was to here. And I knew like I'd become American at some point. Now I am, right? Like, I'm a citizen of
Yeah,
this country, and I love being a citizen of it, even for all of its faults.
of
That might
course.
be the case, right? But yeah, it was what it was, and I had a really strong sense of identity, I had a really strong sense of self, and that was cultivated by and large through spirituality,
Mm.
right? There were things that I just knew that, hey, I'm not ever going to do this. Like, I'm never going to eat meat, for example, right? Like, that's not a thing. That's completely out the window. So all my friends growing up knew I was vegetarian, right? Things like that. It was just like, where you're just like, hey, I'm not going to do this because of my faith. And where was that faith being like cultivated? It was because I used to go to the Mandir every single weekend, right? I used to spend time with those folks quite a bit, with my friends that were from there, that were growing up with me. And so we all were able to like, keep ourselves grounded and within it. I used to do, put in my effort. And I think that's probably something that's pretty critical and important nowadays, is that some people feel like that their identities are being taken away from them as they're growing up. And that's why they fight so strongly and so hardly to like to keep it.
Yeah,
And I'm just like, somebody can label you whatever the heck it is that they want. It doesn't matter.
yeah,
What do you label yourself? It's the
yep,
only thing that matters.
yeah. I, yeah, I think what you've talked about is very similar to what I experienced. I mean, I think the diversity in my school changed as I went through like middle school, because I actually grew up in pretty much rural Pennsylvania, or was rural at that time.
Mm.
So like my elementary school was like the same. I think I was like the only brown kid for miles. And I think when I went to middle school, it changed a little bit, and high school obviously changed a lot. But by that point, it was very different growing up. Like you said, it didn't feel right, and I had a loss of identity, to be honest. And I think I didn't figure out who I was until like dental school, which is crazy to think about.
It
I was
happens, man.
24,
Yeah.
and I went through a lot of struggles recently this past like couple years, like past year or so. And there are times where I should have said things and called things out in my life, but because like you said, you're raised in a certain way because you want to fit in, and my parents always taught me diplomacy over anything else. To stay diplomatic. Don't always say what you want to say, because you want to stay within reason and the law. And a part of me is still very diplomatic, but now I've learned to like just say it how I say it and be authentic and be myself. But I've learned to mesh my diplomacy in that. And sometimes people don't like that, but you have to realize that how you're brought up and the experiences and or even trauma or whatever you want to call it you went through, it plays a part of who you are as an adult. whether healthy or unhealthy. So, like you said, figuring out your identity, it's a key part of our journeys, whether we're Canadians or Americans. It's the struggle of being from an immigrant family, right? But there's a beauty in that whole system. And I think your story really touches on that. I'm sure there's tons of people out there that, want to talk about these things, but we don't. So it's just cool.
Yeah. No, this was it was really refreshing, I'll say.
Yeah.
I don't even know how much time has probably passed by, and
It's
I
like a
mean,
good hour and a half.
yeah,
But
easily, right? But I haven't felt tired once
no.
throughout it, and you're right. People's stories do need to be shared,
Yeah.
and we should be talking about these types of things. Absolutely, for sure. For more than anything, if not just to share a good story, but to also hopefully impart some sort of lesson or knowledge on somebody that might be watching this in the future.
Exactly. It's like you said, our parents and their grandparents and the people around us, they've planted little trees. So we're gonna plant a tree for our hopeful children or whatever in our community. And for me, this podcast is about planting little trees that, whether or not, like I was telling you earlier, it takes off or not, it's not about that. It's about being an open source textbook on life and people's journeys and stories.
Yeah.
And I think there's beauty in that.
Yeah.
Because I think we don't talk about it enough.
You're 100% right. I don't need sorry, I'm not gonna say you don't need this thing to take off, right?
Yeah.
Same thing. I don't need this thing to take off. But if it's there, if it's out there, if it's in the ether, that's something that then I can share with someone, right? Now imagine in 10 years, 15 years or something, you finally found a wife and you settled down, you might have a kid or two, you never know. But you share an episode like this with your kid and be like, if you want to know what your dad was all about during this time in his life, why don't you listen to this, right? And that'll give you a really good perspective and a good bit of clarity. And I can do the same thing too, right? Whenever it is that you upload this or post this, I can download the copy of it and be like, let me keep this away for whenever in the future I feel like somebody should listen to this because I want them to hear my story or I want them to hear this particular thing. That's actually pretty important. And I know there's probably a lot of creators that are out there that are small, right? And they're just oh, I don't have a big following or a big audience. That doesn't matter.
No.
You enjoy what you're doing, and if somebody's finding value out of it, that should inspire you hopefully to continue to keep doing it.
I agree. But we're pretty much done, Shailin. Is there any piece of wisdom or advice you have for the audience? Because I always love talking to you. Even though we don't talk as much as we used to in college and dental school, I always feel like I pick up something from you and I can almost instantly apply it, and I love it. And I end up sharing with 20 people. And yo, where'd you learn that? I was like, oh, a friend and a mentor like Shailin, I've known him. Great guy. But go ahead if you've got any little piece of advice. That'd be great. Actually, wait, let me rephrase it. Because I always ask this question to my guests, and I actually didn't ask it with you for some reason. Maybe it'll actually catalyze it. But if there's 1 to 2 pieces of advice you got from your parents or lessons you've learned from your parents, what would it be and why did it impact you? Let's do that.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a cool one. I do have a piece of advice that I'll part that's separate from this. So one of the lessons that I think I've learned, I'll say from both parents, is that you shouldn't ever be afraid to speak your mind in front of the people that you love. Now, this is challenging, right? I feel like sometimes we can become the worst people to the ones that we love the most because the guardrails are down, the filters are down, etc. And that is that conflict that can then arise from a confrontation or from whatever might be the case is really tough. That plays on some people's head that they almost always just become non-confrontational about it because they're just I don't want to upset that person. Right. Because I love that person and I don't really want to upset them. And I know what they're going through. And it might be tough. It might be hard. X, Y, Z. But that's the one thing that my parents have always told me. There's just don't ever be afraid to tell us how you feel. If you don't think something is right, if you think something is wrong, if you think, X, Y, Z might be the case. Tell us. Right. And I think that's really important lesson because you shouldn't look at having a difficult conversation with somebody as a confrontation with someone. Yeah. We need to separate those two things. It's a difficult conversation for sure, but it is not a confrontation. It doesn't necessarily have to result into a fight. It could just be you expressing your emotions and them having to learn and process and deal with those things. And that is totally okay, right?
I've learned that one recently.
Yeah. So I think that's one thing. And my parents have They've definitely made themselves aware of how they feel about me quite a few times. But it was always almost always out of a place of wanting to push me and inspire me to grow. Now, do you want to interject, or shall I do the advice thing?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Advice.
Yeah, the advice aspect of it. In almost all situations and circumstances, no one has the right answer, but you must pick an answer.
I like that.
And I think it's because it's an overthinking thing. I have a few friends that struggle from it quite a bit, and they're intelligent, right? Despite how many times I may or may not call you an idiot, I think you're smart, right? But they are intelligent. But it's almost always the paralysis of the action, right? Of performing some sort of action that's preventing them from either going towards the next step. And maybe it's because I'm 31 now, and I'm at a point in my life where I feel like I've been lacking patience a bit, and that's a thing that I'll struggle with, like myself, and that's fine. But it's also because I know and I recognize that even by the time that I was like 16, I had failed quite enough in my life, and I had gotten back up quite enough in my life as well, that it didn't almost matter at all whatever the decision was that I took in my failures or in my successes. It mattered that I took a decision and I committed to an action. So yeah, I think in almost any and every single situation, no one is going to know the right action to take, but it matters that you do take some action.
Makes sense. That's beautiful, actually. All right, so last two bits. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know in Hindu culture if you guys do tombstones or how you bury your dead. I'm not too familiar with that. But if you had one, what would it say on there and why?
If I had a tombstone, what would it say? Like an epitaph?
Like an epitaph.
Yeah.
Yeah, or like obituary, whatever.
Here lies Shailin, and he loved his coffee.
Yep. Dude, by the way, speaking of coffee, you realize you made me the biggest coffee aficionado and addict?
Yeah.
I just want you to know that. Like, the addiction started because of you.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm happy to accept that on blame. It's
Hey,
okay.
totally fine.
The reasons for why that's the case. I almost always never try to take myself too seriously.
Yeah, you don't.
And I think it's like it'd be really funny if like that's true, right? Like somebody would read that and be like, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's
like
apt.
that's accurate, that's apt. And I just think it's kind of a funny troll a little bit. Like that's your epitaph,
Yeah.
like that's what you want, irrespective to whatever accomplishments that you might have had in your life or whatever. That's what you want. I'm like, yeah, that's what I want. It's fun. It's
Why not?
It's me. That's why.
It's that. Yeah, that is you, man. Like, I look at coffees and origins and like different ways to press them. People are like, where did this come from? And I was like, yeah, this was my one friend Shailin back in college. Before that, I never even drank coffee. So take whatever pleasure from that you can.
It's funny. As a practicing Muslim, you may never drink alcohol, but I know you'll drink a cup of coffee.
Always, 100%. That's not even a question. All right, and then and then the last thing is, what is or who is Shailin in one word?
Stoic.
Yeah, I can see that.
That's the way I've been trying to live my life a little bit more recently. So I'll go with that. And I think anytime you set an intention or anytime you set a goal, you will find a lot more success if you start to identify yourself with it. If you're like on a journey for like fitness, instead of saying that I'm going to run X amount of miles, you're going to be like, I am a runner and I'm going to do this. Right. Or like if you want to accomplish a marathon, instead of saying like, hey, I'm going to run a marathon, you should identify yourself as, by this time, I will be a marathoner because I'm a marathoner. I'm an athlete, or whatever might be the case. And if you want a job in a particular role, like identify yourself as that. And I think you'll have a lot of success with that, which is why I said stoic, right? Because if you said one word, that's the type of intention I want to impart in my life right now. And then that's the direction I want to go. So stoic.
I love that, Shailin.
What about, I'll put it back on you. What about you? Before you end it, before you conclude it, right now, like, because, it's early into the new year. It's February. January is dry. It's dry January. You're not gonna enjoy
one
that.
word for me.
Yeah, think about it.
I don't think I've ever had a guest reverse a question on me. You're the first, probably, maybe only person. Dogged. I would say I'm a person that doesn't matter how difficult or extreme or difficult it is.
Yeah.
I will find a way to solve it or get through it.
Maybe
That's been my life's journey.
Maybe you need to do a podcast on your journey through dental school, and I can help moderate those questions then, and walk you through it, because I was there for it, and that's a pretty apt way to put it. Dogged
Yeah.
is a really good term. So,
Yeah, but dude, this has been an amazing hour 45. It didn't even feel like an hour 45, just so you
yeah.
know. This is like our typical conversation. So I just want to say thank you for your time, man. I really look forward to, always like, picking your brain about life and just everything in general. So thank you so much for your wisdom and just your knowledge and sharing your journey.
Yeah.
So I really, really appreciate it, man.
Anytime. Thanks. This was a pleasure.
Yeah. And thank you to the MBR audience. It's a little bit longer of a podcast, but I really hope that the wisdom and knowledge and just the conversations we had have really helped you. But until next time, my friends, be well and take care of yourself.